But last week, we looked at how social Darwinism and the social gospel kind of undergirded our thoughts toward non-whites throughout the world, and how those two things were factors in our support for this war against Spain. They were factors for our intervention into these places for commerce and trade, and establishing what we called successful democracies in these places. But in addition, we saw ourselves as this unique Americanized Anglo-Saxon nation. We were just flush with a brand new successful free government, barely 100 years old. And we're already impressing Western Europe with our government, our commercial strength, our success. But we also justified this intervention through our superior religion. The native peoples in these places needed our uplift. We would civilize them. We would establish proper democracies. We would educate and Christianize them. So that's kind of what we covered last week. And this poster is from 1898, and you see Uncle Sam and John Bull, who is Britain's version of Uncle Sam. And you see, oh, what are the two women that symbolize Columbia? Ours is Columbia, and I cannot remember who Britain's is, but you see them there. But it's industry, wealth, commerce, humanity, civilization, freedom. Again, we're seeing success in commerce, success in free government, civilization, and you just kind of see this over and over. The English tongue and kindred interests. The English language was always a big deal with this too. So this week, we're actually going to look at the Spanish-American War and the Philippines, and we're going to see how and why we pursued these economic holdings and political power way beyond just our continental borders. So, well, at the time period, this is kind of at the height of our industrial advances, right at the turn of the century. We're straining our own reserves of raw material, and there were also all kinds of raw materials that we needed, but we didn't have. We couldn't access here in this country, like rubber for automobile tires. And the first sale of an American-made car was in 1895. So we see the demand, we see the potential. So we're starting to look more and more outside of our own borders for all kinds of raw material to feed more industries, and to look towards lesser places that have these materials. So the Treaty of Paris ended the Spanish-American War in 1898. And in 1899, there were 30 American car manufacturers. And within the next 10 years, there were 485 American automobile companies. You know, and rubber was one of these resources we needed. But back to before the war. Okay. European countries, especially England, were already, they're just well established throughout the world. You know, they've got their little empires, and they're getting the raw materials. They're growing new industry. They're controlling the markets. And if we wanted to get in on the game with the big boys, the big powers, if we wanted to continue pursuing our manifest destiny, we needed to get some of our own holdings elsewhere. So how do we start to expand beyond uninhabited Guano Islands to get more resources and raw material? Well, first of all, let's look at Hawaii, which was an independent kingdom, an independent nation. It was one of very few Pacific islands left that weren't held by some European empire. And in 1849, Hawaii, it was already an important stop and supply place for American whaling ships. And it was also a place for Protestant missionaries. So in 1849, we enter a treaty of friendship, commerce, and navigation. But Hawaii was also one of the best harbors in the Pacific, and we started to use it as a coaling station to fuel trade ships. It was a fabulous place to grow sugarcane and pineapple. So in 1875, we negotiated the Commercial Treaty of Reciprocity. This is what allowed United States planters and corporations, growers, to move in and establish sugar and pineapple plantations. Well, this was just so profitable that a small group of white American planters became just the producing powerhouses there in Hawaii. They controlled 4/5 of the sugar and pineapple industry. They controlled 90% of commercial trade. So these US planters, they're just building tremendous fortunes off of this, and also off of cheap labor that they brought in from China. And also some came from the Philippines. So these American elites, they formed this economically elite society that was separate from indigenous Hawaiians. And the planners see this through the social Darwinist lens that we talk about, and they see it as an example of the fittest surviving. Anglo-Americans are so successful in Hawaii because the less fit locals, well, they don't have the capability to turn sugar and pineapple into commerce. And they're not fit for self-government. I mean, they're run by a monarchy. And Anglos, if you remember from last week, they're naturally talented in both commerce and in self-government or free government, whatever they referred. So then in 1890, there's a problem because Congress raised an import tax on foreign sugar, which Hawaiian sugar was. They were their own nation. So now these American planters over there, they're getting undersold. But they knew, well, if Hawaii were to be annexed into, like a territory to the United States, then we wouldn't have this tariff. The tariff wouldn't exist any longer. Hawaii wouldn't be a foreign nation any longer. And Hawaii was a legitimate, recognized foreign nation. In 1893, the kingdom had over 90 consulates throughout the world. And there were 9 consulate offices here in the United States, across the United States in major cities. And the US had like 4 consulates in Hawaii. The ruling monarch was Queen Lulukalani, and she saw these sugar planters getting more and more powerful to the point of, it's becoming foreign interference. So in 1893, she moves to strengthen the monarchy and place more governmental oversight on these outside planters. And when she did, American planters under the leadership of Sanford Dole of Dole Pineapple, they deposed her. They were backed by the American minister there in Hawaii and a small contingent of US Marines. So this wasn't a big bloody affair or anything, because the Queen conditionally surrendered to avoid that. And in her conditional surrender, she called on the United States government to undo the actions of Sanford Dole. Dole, in the meantime, declared Hawaii as the independent Republic of Hawaii with him as president. And he and his folks claimed that, well, we're overthrowing a corrupt regime and we are going to implement a free democratic institution and principles over this despotic monarch. Well, what it did was it allowed them to seize about 2 million acres of crown land and conspire to annex the islands to the United States. So they sent a delegation to Washington asking to be annexed. The president at the time is President Harrison. He's finishing out his term. And in his very last month in office, he sent an annexation treaty to the Senate for confirmation. But by now, the new president is Grover Cleveland. And Cleveland was very outspoken. He's what they called an anti-imperialist. He was not about going out and taking over other places in the world. So Cleveland, he withdrew the annexation treaty from the Senate, and he ordered this whole mess to be investigated because he knew the Queen had only surrendered conditionally and had asked the United States to undo this whole thing. And this is what her conditional surrender said. I gotta move something here, hold on. Okay. She says, I, Lulukalani, by the grace of God and under the Constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom, Queen, do hereby solemnly protest against any and all acts done against myself and the constitutional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom by certain persons claiming to have established a provisional government of and for this kingdom. I'll just skip that second one and I'm going to go down to the third one. Now, to avoid any collision of armed forces and perhaps the loss of life, I do, under this protest and impelled by said force, yield my authority until such time as the government of the United States shall, upon the facts being presented to it, undo the action of its representatives and reinstate me in the authority which I claim as the constitutional sovereign of the Hawaiian Islands. So that was her condition. That was her surrender under protest. So now Cleveland is in office. Let me see if I can't get this to. Okay, hold on. My screen isn't moving here. Okay. Can you guys see this okay? Can you all see the screen okay?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, just wanted to be sure. Okay, so Cleveland, he has the House Foreign Relations Committee do an investigation, and it's called the Blunt Affair, the Blunt Report, because it's led by James Blunt. It started in April, and by July, they had the investigation done, and this is what they'd found, that American businessmen had conspired to overthrow the Queen, that the coup would have failed but for the landing of the United States forces upon false pretext respecting the dangers to life and property. The provisional government owes its existence to an armed invasion by the United States. So basically, that's how Sanford Dole took power. And by an act of war, a substantial wrong has been done, an act of war that was never declared by Congress. So President Cleveland, he called the members of Dole's government, as he called them insurgents, who carried out an act of war without the authority of Congress, and he recommended that the monarchy be restored. Well, Congress rejected his recommendation, and the Senate wanted to do their own investigation. And so they just dragged this thing out until Cleveland's term ends. And McKinley is sworn in as president. But look at how the Queen is portrayed in the American media. This we'll look a lot at some examples next week, but this directly reflects our ideas and rankings of human superiority and inferiority. This cartoon ran in 1893, shortly after the overthrow. And so you see the Queen here. She's in a pawn shop, handing over her crown, saying, "How much can you lend me on this Honolulu crown?" And the pawnbroker says, "I might have let you have a few sandwiches a month ago, but it isn't worth a wisp of hay now." The Sandwich Islands were a nickname for Hawaii, which is what he's referring to. But how have they portrayed the Queen? Look at the exaggerated feet and hands, the exaggerated lips, the hair. And you often see these kinds of exaggerations of African Americans. We'll start to see them with not only with Hawaii, but we're going to start to see them with how we see all these Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. They represent these people very, very similar. Look at how she's represented here. Again, it's the typical portrayal of how the media often portrayed African Americans at the time. That's who she really is. She just doesn't match what the media is putting her out to be. Well, the Republican Party platform in the presidential election of 1896 called for the annexation of Hawaii. And William McKinley, the new president, he's very, very supportive of this. And he openly supports Dole. Queen Lulukalani was also in Washington at the time that this election is coming up. She submitted a formal protest with the State Department. And this is what her protest said. This is part of it. Now, this was just a petition here signed by a lot of women in Hawaii. But in her petition, the Queen says, "I declare such a treaty, the annexation treaty, to be an act of wrong toward the native and part native people of Hawaii, an invasion of the rights of the ruling chiefs, in violation of international rights, both toward my people and toward friendly nations with whom they have made treaties, the perpetuation of the fraud whereby the constitutional government was overthrown, and finally, an act of gross injustice to me." After this, Congress killed this treaty to annex Hawaii, even though McKinley was really pushing for it. So it looks like this isn't going to go through. It is going to be shown to be a real fraud, and she's going to get her kingdom back. But 1 month later, in April of 1897, Congress declared war on Spain, and the Hawaiian situation completely changed, especially as we became more involved in the Philippines. So let's look first at the Spanish-American War. Okay, this is showing empires in 1800. Spain is in yellow. So at the time, Spain, you would only see yellow in the Caribbean and in the Philippines. Spain had weakened a whole lot. For years, though, Spain had a huge worldwide empire with control in South America, Latin America, North America. But now we're at the end of the 19th century, and the Spanish Empire has been weakening more and more and more. And the native folks in Cuba and in the Philippines, they were rebelling for independence. And this was especially in Cuba and the Caribbean. These places, the Caribbean, they're very, very attractive to the United States because they had resources we needed. They had sugar, they had minerals, had rubber, but and the native inhabitants in Cuba and the Caribbean, they were already colonized by Spain. So all these resources, the extraction of the resources, the refining of the resources, the exporting of the resources, all these systems were already established. And there's a cheap labor force that's already operating. We just had to take it and improve it for what, transition it to our needs. And Spain's weaknesses gave us the inroads to be able to do that. So let's see. So in 1895, Cuba revolts once again against the Spanish. And we're very, very supportive of Cuba. We're comparing them to like our revolution against Britain. But we stay neutral till something happened that would allow us to jump in militarily. And that happened in February of 1898. One of our battleships, the USS Maine, was blown up in Havana Harbor. And to this day, we don't know exactly what caused the explosion. There's several reasons that it could have exploded, but this gave us a reason to step in. We claimed it was an intentional act by Spain. She was mined by Spain. And this is all we needed to declare war. And you'll see on the left, the headlines on the left, destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. Assistant Secretary Roosevelt convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident. And further down near the bottom, naval officers think the Maine was destroyed by a Spanish mine. And you see another little inset, the bloodthirsty Spaniards blow up United States man-of-war Maine in Havana Harbor. Maine explosion caused by a bomb or torpedo. Also, this is a time of what they refer to as yellow journalism. And especially the New York Herald and the New York World were just battling between each other to give the best story and to get the most readers. And honestly, they weren't too concerned about truth, but there was a lot of yellow journalism, not just in those two, but in others as well, that was just sensational, built up to get readers and that kind of thing. So propaganda is just rife in the newspapers. Competition to sell papers, and it's forming the public's opinion toward the war, which is very popular. On the right in Judge magazine, you see Uncle Sam, remember the Maine, but don't forget the starving Cubans either, and so they show some starving Cubans there on the right, and pulling at the heartstrings of the country. And then on the left, you see that the Spanish brute adds mutilation to murder. Maine sailors are murdered by Spain, and of course, Spain is shown as an animal, a monster. So this is pretty interesting here. This Frederick Remington, he's a very famous painter of the American West, but he also did a lot of illustrating for different newspapers and magazines. And this is one of the drawings that he did. I don't know if it's for the New York World or what, but it's just propaganda. Spaniards search women on American steamers as if you're a woman on an American steamer and your ship is stopped by the Spaniards, you're going to get strip searched. So there's a lot of this propaganda, yellow journalism. And this helped to build a lot of nationalism in the United States with the US public and also in Congress. And of course, now Hawaii is really important in the Pacific because Spain also holds the Philippines, although we're not really thinking about the Philippines at this point. But the US annexed Hawaii in 1898, declared it a territory, installed a military base, and Sanford Dole, who you can see right there in the middle, is its first governor. And this is Iona Palace, the palace of the Kingdom of Hawaii. It's been taken over. This was a very popular war, especially from how the press presented it and also from strong imperialists, politicians, people who wanted to expand and grow power, political hawks, military hawks, a lot of American corporate interests in these places. Protestant religious leaders who believed we had a mission to take Protestantism. It's a time, we're very anti-Catholic at the time. And this is being stirred here in the US by a lot of rising immigration from Italy and other Catholic areas of the Mediterranean. And America at the time, it's vocally pro-Protestant. And we looked at Spain, it was a Catholic empire, a savage dictator over these places. Imperialists supported the war with a lot of social Darwinist ideas. And you'll see here too, we're looking, well, the first one, the little frying pan, is Cuba. And it's like the duty of the hour. We've got to save her not only from Spain, but from a worse fate. If it collapses, Cuba will fall into anarchy. We've got to be there to establish the proper government. At the top, you'll see two pieces of music, the blue and the gray together, and "We'll Stand for the Flag." And at this period of time, there was a lot of Civil War veterans who came together in support of the Spanish-American War. You'll see that. A lot of patriotic stuff down below. A good example of an imperialist is Josiah Strong. I mentioned him last week as one of the big leaders of the social gospel movement and a strong believer in social Darwinism. And I believe I even pointed out this book that he wrote in 1885. It was very influential, very popular. It's called Our Country, Its Possible Future and Its Present Crisis. Now, he originally intended to promote or recruit missionaries with this and promote missionary work, but it came out at this time of growing imperialistic spirit, and it really encouraged the public to support that. So I'm going to stop sharing this for just a second. Hold on a second. Let me stop the share here. Okay. On the right. Okay. On the right, I see where Tom has put in the chat the link to a document on Google Drive. Can you guys click on that? Can you access that? Joy does. All right. Can anybody else? Access that?
I can access it, but it's my Google Drive. Anybody else?
In the chat box, do you guys
Yeah.
have your chat open? The very first, well, it was posted at 7:02. If you came in after that, it won't show. So,
Oh, can I?
Oh, you
copy-
should get.
Whoops.
You should
no,
get the
no,
whole
no.
chat.
If you come in after it, you don't see stuff that was there.
Ah,
I
ah,
promise you. So you might want to
Weird.
post it again.
I'm just going to post it again.
okay, okay. I did not know that. Joy, you're full of good information.
Yeah. that's
And
good.
other things, among other things.
Okay. Okay, Tom just posted it again. Do you all see it?
Now they got something.
And you click on it.
Yes.
Good. Okay, Cooper, how about you? Are you able to access it? Okay. Dr. Brinkman, how about you? Were you able to click on it? Okay, I think you're muted. You're muted. Okay, we might not be able to work with this. I think it's going to be kind of tough for everybody to get a hold of it. But I really want to encourage everybody to look at the excerpts that are in this document from Josiah Strong and this particular book. It really hits on, well, a lot of the things that we talked about last week, but on his whole premise is Anglo-Saxons, we've got these two great innate aspects, and that is civil liberty. And the second is we are of a pure spiritual Christianity. And he goes on to talk about the purity of our faith and of our ability to have free and self-government, and that North America is going to be the great home of the Anglo-Saxon, the principal seat of power, and that our continent is the zone of power, and already we are leading in wealth. So he goes on with some things about Mr. Darwin, and that the wonderful progress of the United States, as well as the character of the people, are the results of natural selection. Because the more energetic, restless, and courageous men from all different parts of Europe came here within the last 10 or so generations and just established this great country. And now the time is coming when we are getting to the final competition of the races for which the Anglo-Saxon is being prepared. And the United States is just unequaled in its ability, its energy, its wealth, its civilization. So it's an important piece to read because it really pushes for imperialism. Josiah Strong is a great example of an imperialist. And this is a perfect piece to read to get that understanding, to get that flavor of how it was being argued at the time. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. All right. Here we go. Okay, can everybody see it? Okay. I'm assuming that you can. All right, imperialists, though, they weren't the only ones with opinions about this, okay? And I cannot get this to move. Here we go. Now I'm getting it. They weren't the only ones with opinions on this, because we also had anti-imperialists who did not think we needed to expand into the world. We did not need to get involved in other nations or other nations' business. And the largest of them was the Anti-Imperialist League. It was founded in 1898. It had about 500,000 members. That's really nothing to sneeze at. And in 1899, they have their big annual conference in Chicago. Now, at that time, we'd already signed the Treaty of Paris, which had ended the Spanish-American War. But at the time, we were now also stuck in this brutal guerrilla conflict in the Philippines. And these are some of their writings on this and what they said in their official voice about the Philippines. And in that same document, there are excerpts from some of their statements. And in fact, I'm just going to read some of this to you here. We hold that the policy known as imperialism is hostile to liberty and tends toward militarism, an evil from which it has been our glory to be free. We maintain that the governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. We insist that the subjugation of any people is criminal aggression and open disloyalty to the distinctive principles of our government. Consent of the government. So they condemn the policies in the Philippines. They denounced the slaughter of the Filipinos as a needless horror. They demanded the immediate cessation of the war against liberty because the Filipinos wanted their independence. And we urged that Congress be promptly convened to announce independence for the Philippines. So you see that, there's a whole other side to this. And another really good example of an anti-imperialist, it's also in that document, is a piece by Mark Twain called The War Prayer. And I really encourage you all to read that in that link. It's a really good example. And of course, only Twain could write it the way he did. But Twain was a staunch, avid anti-imperialist. And he wrote the War Prayer actually in 1905, but he never published it. And it is dealing with the Philippines. He never published it because his family was afraid it would really come to haunt him because it seemed so sacrilegious. It takes place in a church. His friends and his publisher didn't want him to publish it either. So it wasn't published until 1923, after he's already dead, in an anthology of his works. Okay, so through the Spanish-American War, that's how the United States emerged out as an imperialist nation. We've got Hawaii and Puerto Rico as territories. We've got Cuba as a protectorate. But that's not all, because we also became entrenched in the Philippines, who they do not want Spain there. They don't want us there. They don't want anybody there running their affairs. They just want their independence. They've been under Spanish rule for about 300 years, and they're just done. So simultaneously with the Spanish-American War in the Atlantic, the Philippines were rebelling against the Spanish colonial rule in the Pacific. And this was led by a young revolutionary, 28 years old. His name is Emilio Aguinaldo. But in 1897, Spain was defeating them. They had this uprising against Spain, and Spain was defeating them. So Aguinaldo said, okay, I'll have my people, we're going to put down our weapons, and I will I'll leave the island. I will go to Hong Kong. He basically went into exile in Hong Kong. And this temporarily ended the Philippine Revolution against Spain, and Spain is still in control. Okay. So at that time, we're not really pursuing any action in the Philippines. We hadn't really thought much about them. You know, they're on the other side of the world. We want Cuba and Puerto Rico. But there were problems with our Navy in the Far East that that created this situation that we had to make a decision on. And this is what it is. This is so crazy that we get involved in this over this. At the time, we had the United States Asiatic Squadron. Okay, this was our Pacific Squadron, and it was based out of British Hong Kong. They're there for, you know, protecting just like US merchant ships and whatnot, you know, protect them against piracy, that kind of thing. But after the main explosion in Cuba, we declared war on Spain, but Britain is keeping neutrality in this. So since Britain is neutral, that means our Asiatic Squadron couldn't stay in the Hong Kong harbor or any other neutral port. So we're in this situation where we had to use the Asiatic Squadron somehow, or we were going to lose it. Have to send it back home or something. So now there's another concern that comes in there, because we're thinking, or military and political leaders are thinking, Spain is so weak, some other imperial power is going to sweep in and take the Philippines without a whole lot of effort. So now we're getting concerned about the Philippines and whose power they might end up in. So in 1898, Commodore George Dewey becomes really famous from this. He destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. And Spain had this very poor, old, outdated weaponry and technology. One of their ships was even a wooden ship that had to be towed, a wooden steamer. Dewey's fleet, on the other hand, I mean, they're pretty up to date and modern. It just wasn't much of a battle, but it got a lot of popularity for Dewey, who becomes admiral in the United States. Okay, so this Aguinaldo, he's still in exile in Hong Kong. So he arranges with the United States to return to the Philippines and assist the United States in this war against Spain. So he lands just a few days after this Battle of Manila Bay. He pulled his revolutionaries back together and starts liberating towns from the Spanish. And they're proclaiming Philippine independence. The thing is, they expected independence more or less on terms like Cuba, that we would just be a protectorate of them. But the United States is very concerned because Philippines is way far away than Cuba. So the United States is thinking this brand new native-led government, they're not going to stand a chance with big bad Germany or some other empire out there, you know, eyeballing them. And the Germans also, they had already sent some naval vessels to the area to kind of, you know, case the joint out to see what's going on. So again, we have that fear of another empire, another power swooping in and taking the Philippines. So by now, the Senate is deciding whether or not to ratify the Treaty of Paris and end this war. But here's this new issue with the Philippines. You know, what are we going to do? Are we going to leave it in the hands of a weak and dying Spain? Or are we going to leave it with this brand new weak Philippine government and just allow some other imperialist power to come in and take it? Or should we take it ourselves and make sure none of that happens? And President McKinley is debating this issue over and over in his mind. He's very, very torn about how are we going to deal with it. You know, and he's lying awake at night. He can't sleep under the burden of what am I going to do with the Philippines? And in 1903, McKinley talks about that night in an interview with a guy named General James Russling for the Christian Advocate magazine. And he did this interview and he writes about, McKinley's remembrances. And McKinley told Russling that in November of 1899, he had met with 5 leaders of the Methodist Episcopal Church in the White House. And this is what he says in his interview. Let me see if I have it. Okay, this is what he said in his interview. The truth is, I didn't want the Philippines. And when they came to us as a gift from the gods, I didn't know what to do with them. When I next realized that the Philippines had dropped into our laps, I confess I didn't know what to do with them. I sought counsel from all sides, Democrats as well as Republicans, but got little help. I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight, and I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. And then one night, late, it came to me this way. I don't know how it was, but it came. Number one, that we could not give them back to Spain. That would be cowardly and dishonorable. Number two, that we could not turn them over to France or Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be bad for business and discreditable. Third, we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government. They would soon have anarchy and misrule over there, worse than Spain's was. And 4, that there was nothing less for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. And by God's grace, do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. And then I went to bed and went to sleep and slept soundly. And the next morning I sent for the chief engineer of the War Department and I told him to put the Philippines on the map of the United States. And there they are, and there they will stay until I am president. And folks, right there you have it. Those are the philosophies of social Darwinism and the social gospel that we talked about last week. This is what drove McKinley's decision to intervene in the Philippines, as well as this fear of another empire taking control. Racial, religious, free self-government, commercial concepts, business, they drove our foreign policy. Josiah Strong himself could have written this as a speechwriter. So now we become stuck in a quagmire in the Philippines. And it's just an ugly, brutal guerrilla war. Such that by the end, let me make sure I don't have another. Such that by the end of 1899, there were 65,000 US troops in the Philippines. And over 4,000 Americans died in this quagmire. And that's not that much, but the comparison is it was more than 10 times the number of Americans killed in the entire Spanish-American War. You know, and then you think about what did the Philippines lose? You know, they lost over 20,000 guerrillas or insurgents, fighters. And who knows how many civilians died in this thing. But then in 1935, that is when the United States finally approved a commonwealth for the Philippines. We gave them their independence. July 1946, we granted them full independence. You know, there was a little time, about a 10-year transition period there. But the Spanish-American War is what put us on the world stage of imperialism, this, up to snuff with all the Western European Joneses. And if you remember this from last week, Cecil Rhodes, the British, he's got the continent of Africa. Well, now we're the Colossus of the Pacific. Uncle Sam, we have Uncle Sam as the Colossus of the Pacific. Our power and control span the Philippines to Hawaii to San Francisco. So next week, we're going to spend some time looking at editorial cartoons, political cartoons that were in the press. And they really reflect a lot about how we viewed the people in these territories that we had just obtained and shaped our views towards them as human beings. So that's where we're going to head to next week. I'm going to stop sharing this screen. Hold on a second. There we go. Okay. So I had to leave. Okay, Tawny. I hate you had to go. Okay, is there anything anybody wants to elaborate on or talk about, have questions about?
Well, I do. Can I ask something?
Yes, Joy, go ahead.
I hear you talking a lot about social Darwinism and religion and nationalism and that kind of stuff. And you did mention early in the discussion that, this was motivated by economics, because, for instance, we don't have rubber here,
Right.
to go get rubber. So I'm just kind of like, what, from a communist perspective, imperialism is generally thought of as a symptom of the end of capitalism, end product of capitalism. So how would you relate all of this stuff, the social Darwinism and the all of these aspects that you're talking about, to capitalism and what's going
Okay.
on?
Yeah. I know.
Captains of industry and all that crap.
Joy, why weren't you here last week?
I was late. I came. I caught like the last 5
Oh, it's
minutes.
okay.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. No, that is a huge part of it. And with social Darwinism, it applied the survival of the fittest concept to society and to business. So it equated wealth with the more fit. You're fitter. So Standard Oil, is that at my house? Hold on. Hey, Bill? I don't know what that was. But Standard Oil was the monopoly and the big successful corporation that it was because it was the fittest, it was the best. It was supposed to be what it was. It all worked together. And because it's applying both to society and to business. It's the natural, this is just the natural way it is. The American planters and all in Hawaii, they were successful. Yes, of course they had 90% of the commerce because they just are naturally better at this. The Hawaiians couldn't do it themselves. So capitalism is all throughout there. Absolutely.
And I guess at this point, there's no concern for the natural world. It's just there to be exploited. It hasn't crossed anybody's mind, at least no Westerner's mind,
Well,
that,
yeah,
that maybe the profit was not the
we
only
might run out of
measurement.
yeah. Actually, it is funny though, because one of the first people to see this and to want to do something about preserving is Theodore Roosevelt. And yet he's one of the biggest empire builders and imperialists. So it's almost like he wants to preserve and keep these places that are pristine, but if there's wealth to be made out, all around, he's going to make it.
Well,
That's interesting. That's an interesting thing you bring up there.
and he wasn't concerned about keeping anything pristine on other continents, was he?
Absolutely. I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't. And even his, he did some exploring and all in the Amazon. And it was like, that was for commercial reasons.
Identifying resources, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting stuff there. It really is.
Yeah, I think the most symbolic thing is Stanford Dole, captain of industry, declaring himself to be president of Hawaii.
And then when we annex the place, he's put in charge.
Yeah.
Joy, I think you'll really like reading that piece by Josiah Strong.
I got it open.
It brings in the commercial
I
success.
think by really like, you mean that I'll really hate it.
Forget it. You'll see where they merge all this stuff together. They merge religion, commerce, and race and democracy. They merge it.
Ah.
Yeah.
It's all together.
Mm.
And only we have it. Only the Anglo-Saxon, really only the Anglo-American really has it, because that's what Josiah Strong is arguing. We are the seat of power. Crazy stuff. Yes.
I know some people like that who think they're the center of the universe.
Yeah.
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 Well, that woman that accosted us a couple of weekends ago at the Peace Corner,
Yeah.
was like, my daughter-in-law is half black, but my grandpappy or great grandpappy or whatever fought in the Civil War for the white landowners. You should be ashamed of yourself, Like, what?
Yeah, really. What?
I think her point was that if your skin is not dark, then what are you doing advocating for Black Lives Matter? She couldn't get her mind around that.
Wow.
And I pointed out that Jesus was brown,
No, he wasn't. No, he wasn't.
Oh, she was just like, I don't know about Jesus. I don't know what color he was,
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Don't confuse me with facts.
Well, I appreciate all of you guys being here tonight. And I hope you can make it next week. We'll get into, let's see, what am I going to get into next week?
You've got a week to think about it.
Yeah, but I kind of have it somewhat. Let's see. Oh yeah, we're going to look at some great editorial cartoons. They're fabulous, and you see all these elements in there, every one of them. Yeah, we'll take a look at that. And I think the week after is when we'll start to hit on some Supreme Court cases. And okay, so how are we going to look at these people? What is their status? Are they Americans? What's going to happen here? We'll look at that the week after, I think. Well, thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you,
Thank
Jeanne.
you.
All right.
Fascinating.
I'll see
Am
y'all
I
next
able
week.
to, I'm sorry,
No,
I-
go right ahead.
I missed last week's class. Sorry, had a PTA meeting. Is there possible for me to get the readings from last week?
Oh, the recording, access the recording maybe.
Yeah, do you mean the recording?
Either or both if if
Okay.
there were readings from last week.
Danita, there was one.
Yeah,
And
I could share the recording. It's
you
not
shared the
edited
recording?
yet, you know,
Okay.
but I have the raw recording and I could
Okay, and I could
share
send
that.
you, Danita, I can send you the one reading we had. What's your email?
You just put
It
it in the
Just put it in
box.
the chat.
Yep.
That's just what I needed. I'll send you a link to the recording, Danita.
Okay,
Hey,
that was-
send it to me too, because I missed almost 100% of last week.
Excellent. I can
Okay,
send you
see,
my
Danita.
notes such as they are.
All right.
oh, that'd be awesome. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, I'll send you the one article that we looked at, just to kind of get you familiar. It was kind of an overview of social Darwinism. 944 @gmail. Yeah, I'll do that. And if Tom will get you the recording, that'll be great.
Yep, I'll share that. in a little
Okay.
bit.
All right. We'll see everybody next week, I hope.
All
Thank
right,
you.
Thank you,
thanks
Jean.
so
next week.
much.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.